Vampires have existed in lore and legend across the world since ancient times. In Europe, they are mostly associated with Slavic folklore, yet Britain has seen many of these creatures of the night causing havoc and terror across the centuries. Now, most people would struggle to name even one vampire story from Britain, with the exception of the fictional novel Dracula, which sees him arrive in Whitby. So, the following is a list of 10 vampire stories from England, Scotland and Wales. The first story comes from the Scottish borders town of Melrose. There was once a priest that lived a far from godly life. He was so wicked that when he died his spirit was denied rest. Every night he would rise from the grave and terrorise the people of Melrose, draining the blood of his victims. He tried to enter Melrose Abbey in the form of a monstrous bat, but the monks drove him back again and again. One night, 4 monks were tasked to guard the grave of the vampire priest, expecting him to rise up at midnight. When he failed to appear, 3 of the monks left for shelter in a nearby cottage to warm themselves by the fire, but 1 remained. No sooner had they left, but the grave opened up, and the vampire appeared in his monstrous form. He tried to attack the monk, but the monk hit him with an axe that he'd brought with him, and the creature retreated back into its grave. The next morning, the 4 monks dug up the body to discover it exactly as it had been when the priest was buried, except for a giant axe wound. They carried it outside the church burial grounds and burned it, scattering the ashes to the winds. Our next story comes from Wales. There was once an old farmhouse in Glamorgan, and one apartment was used as a guest chamber. In the 18th century, a pious minister visited the farm and was given this room. He arrived on Friday night and woke very early the next morning, wishing to read the Bible as the sun rose. He sat in an old armchair by the window and remained there for a few hours. When he eventually got up, the minister realised that his hand was bleeding. Washing away the blood, he saw that the scar resembled teeth marks. Over breakfast, he told his host that the chair must have a loose nail, which caused him to bleed. The hostess replied that many guests in the past had complained about that chair. That night, the minister was disturbed by what felt like a dog gnawing his flesh on his left side. The following morning, he found bite marks all across his body, and when he went outside to feed his horse, he was shocked to see bite marks on its neck. The minister was then told by the hostess that the furniture in that room contained the spirit of its dead previous owner, and he did not like ministers of the gospel. The Vampire of Croglin Grange is one of Cumberland's most eerie tales. An old house had been rented out to a woman and 2 brothers, Amelia, Edward and Michael Cranswell. One night, Amelia was trying to sleep when a strange creature appeared at a window. It managed to get inside the room, and the 2 brothers awoke to the sound of their sister screaming. They rushed to the room and found Amelia crying, with blood pouring from her neck. The siblings soon took a trip to Switzerland to help Amelia recover, and then returned to Croglin Grange. They suspected the creature might return on the first night back, and they were right. The brothers took turns to stand guard in the corner of Amelia's room while she slept. The vampire once more entered the room, and one of the brothers shot it in the leg with his rifle. It retreated back outside and fled, and the lads tracked it to a vault in the local cemetery. The next day, they opened the vault and discovered a body with a fresh gunshot wound in the leg, resting inside a coffin. They took the corpse outside and burned it, putting the vampire to rest. The Highgate Vampire came to national attention in the 1960s and 70s. Highgate Cemetery was at this time just over 100 years old and had fallen into ruin and disrepair. In 1963, a couple were walking home down Swains Lane, which passed along the cemetery's north gate. Suddenly, they encountered a dark, tall figure floating behind the railings. It had a ghoulish and nightmarish face. They were terrified and fixed to the spot. More sightings would soon follow, including David Farrant, a member of the British Occult Society, who was said to have seen the vampire. In December 1969, he camped out in the cemetery and witnessed a tall, dark figure with piercing, hypnotic eyes. The air suddenly turned freezing cold. Reports of Satanists performing black magic in the cemetery led to a belief that it was them who had unleashed this creature. A man named Sean Manchester, who claimed to be a vampire hunter, came on the scene, claiming that the Highgate Vampire was an undead 15th century Romanian nobleman. He led a hunt in the cemetery, accompanied by hundreds of witnesses. While no vampire was caught, many did report seeing a tall, shadowy man floating through the grounds of the cemetery. The Anik Vampire is one of the oldest vampire tales in England. The lord of the Anik estate in Northumberland suspected that his wife was being unfaithful. He sat on the roof of Anik Castle while his wife was in congress with another man in the room below. During this act, the roof gave way and the man fell through, landing on the floor of their room. His wife took to caring for a severely injured husband and confirmed that his suspicions were false. Yet the man was so preoccupied with his wife's unfaithfulness that he forgot to confess his sins on his deathbed. From that moment on, he was doomed to walk the earth as a vampire. He began to terrorize Anik, rising up from the tunnels beneath the castle. It was said that a priest and a local mob entered the castle vaults and burned the corpse of the former lord. But there is, on occasion still to this day, reports that the vampire is seen stalking the castle grounds. An unnamed man died in 1192 in Buckinghamshire and was buried on the eve of Ascension Day. But the night after burial, the man left his grave and came to his wife, leaping upon her while she slept and nearly killing her with the press of his weight. He did the same the next night, and on the third night, the wife gathered friends to keep vigil for her and remained awake in order to repel her dead husband. When the vampire arrived, he was driven away by the shouts and cries of the wife and her friends. Instead, he attacked his brothers, who lived in the same town. The brothers were, like the wife, forced to stay awake at night and make great noises in order to repel the vampire. As a result, the vampire began attacking other sleeping people, as well as animals who were resting. After a long period of harassing people, he began appearing in the daylight. The townspeople appealed to Archdeacon Stephen for help, who wrote a letter to St. Hugh, the Bishop of Lincoln, asking what should be done to deal with this evil. St. Hugh consulted priests and theologians, and learned to his astonishment that similar attacks had occurred elsewhere in England, like Anik. Although he was told that no peace would be had until the corpse was dug up and burned. But he rejected that as undesirable, and so he wrote out an absolution and told the archdeacon to open the tomb and place it on the corpse's chest, then reseal the tomb. The townspeople did just that, and the vampire never troubled anyone again. The Scottish Highlands are home to a race of fairy vampire creatures known as the Pavanshi. They appear as beautiful women, usually wearing a long dress that conceals their hoof-like feet. Much like usual other vampires, the Pavanshi drink the blood of their victims and perish if exposed to sunlight. There are many recorded stories of these vampires, all of which seem to involve groups of men that find themselves wandering the highlands and desiring female company. There were once some hunters that took refuge in a hut once it got dark. One of the men provided vocal music, while the others began to dance. As soon as the men expressed a wish for some girls to join them, a few of the Pavanshi entered the hut and began to dance with the men. The only man that didn't participate noticed blood dripping from his friends. He ran outside, being chased by one of the vampires, and took refuge among the horses. The iron on their feet prevented the creatures from getting near him. When he entered the hut again the next morning, he found the hunters drained of their blood. In South Shields, there was once an old baker that provided poor quality bread for the townspeople. One day another baker opened up with a much larger selection of goods. The townspeople took their business to this new shop, leaving the old baker with no customers. Enraged and feeling betrayed, he closed himself off from the world and was soon forgotten. One day after school, some children noticed a body lying on the floor of the old closed bakery as they glanced through the window on the way home. Alerting the adults, a large crowd then gathered and kicked the door in. He'd been dead for days, his wrists slit. He'd committed suicide and was totally white as a sheet. The local priest pointed out that the baker could return from the grave as a vampire, using the examples of Melrose and Anik to prove that it can and does happen. Later that night, the priest and a large crowd gathered on the nearby playing field. Some men had dug a very deep grave, and then lowered down an open coffin containing the dead baker. Some more local men carried over a huge wooden pole. They pierced the baker's heart with it and held it in place while others filled the grave in. For years after, the children of South Shields played around this big pole, ensuring that the would-be vampire stayed in his grave. In 1954, it was said that a vampire had murdered and drank the blood of 2 young schoolboys in the Gorbals in Glasgow. In response to this, hundreds of schoolchildren descended upon the southern necropolis graveyard, armed with stakes, knives, and dogs. It was said that this creature had blood-red eyes, iron teeth, and was 7 foot in height. At the local school, the headmaster denounced the story as nonsense and warned children against believing in such a ridiculous tale. But the following night, and the night after that, the Gorbals children came out in force, looking to kill the vampire. On my channel, you can find the full story of this, as well as footage and a tour of that graveyard. Our final story comes from the border town of BardUPONTweed. There was once a rich merchant that lived here during the reign of Richard I. He was known as a very religious man, and unfortunately died of the plague. Only after his death did the folk of Berwick discover that this man had led a very corrupt and sinful life, and so they denied his burial on consecrated land. Soon after his funeral, terrible incidents took place in Berwick. The merchant had begun to rise from the grave in search of human flesh. This creature would bolt through the streets looking for victims, shouting, "Until my body is burned, you folk of Berwick shall have no peace." Behind the vampire, a pack of howling dogs followed him, their loud baying keeping villagers awake every night. 10 young farmhands were selected to exhume the merchant's grave and dismember the body and burn it until only ashes remained. But not long after the destruction of the vampire, the plague returned to Berwick, claiming half the population. Villagers claimed, as they burned their dead, that the sound of baying hounds and the fearful screams of the vampire could be heard. And so concludes this video on 10 vampires from British folklore. It's important that we remember these tales and continue to pass them down for future generations. The vampire does not belong to Hollywood, but belongs to the folklore of the people. If you enjoyed this video, please do share it and help this channel grow so more people can learn about our legends, mythology and folklore.